You've got to plan for the disposal of all the dead, possibly with mass burials, for the destruction of animal carcasses, also for all...
A man with more power than any Englishman has had for centuries. In Newswatch tonight, how he might use it. Newswatch, don't forget your raincoat.
Now, the priority task for this group is to transfer these refugees to proper emergency accommodation, proper emergency centres.
The man making those awesome decisions is a local government officer. His name is Tony Dennis, and he's the Chief Executive of Cornwall County Council. He holds another appointment, though, Controller, a post which gives him more personal power than any man in England since Magna Carta, a post which, in effect, makes him a dictator, free to decide who among us may live or die without any of the tiresome restraints of democracy. All it needs is a quick act of Parliament and this. How well prepared are we? Is any preparation worthwhile? No one seems to have thought much about civil defence for 10 years or more. How many people even know that it's called home defence nowadays? Successive governments have kept its profile so low that the subject has almost disappeared from public awareness.
The government disbanded the Civil Defence Corps 11 years ago. Local authorities were told to draw up their own plans for a nuclear emergency. They were left with a limited amount of equipment. The rest went to Home Office stores to be kept on a care and maintenance basis. Among the hardware gathering dust today, hundreds of Geiger counters for measuring radioactivity. The auxiliary fire service was mothballed as well. It had 14,000 members and cost £1 million a year to run. The government said the price was too high.
Until then, Cornwall, for example, had a civil defence team of 2,000 people, trained, able volunteers who gave up their spare time to learn rescue, firefighting and nursing techniques. This is Cornwall's home defence team now. Bill Vickers, the county emergency officer, in the middle, Bob Redding, his deputy, and Sylvia James, their clerk. They planned Cornwall's preparations for nuclear war, and this week they put their plans to the test.
Now, I must remind you it is D+7, and I've called you all to this conference because it's time for some detailed planning of our priority jobs.
9 o'clock Tuesday morning, the basement of County Hall, Truro. Outside, the people of Cornwall go peacefully about their business. Down here, there's a war going on.
And since the attack, refugees have been coming in from Saltash and Torpoint, the damaged areas.
Britain is reeling from the effects of a major nuclear strike. It's 7 days since the bombs dropped. The level of radiation is beginning to fall. The controller is at last able to get to grips with the devastation and chaos.
You've got to plan for the disposal of all the dead, possibly with mass burials, for the destruction of animal carcasses.
Large parts of the county are in ruins. The need now is for emergency kitchens, casualty and refugee centres, road clearance, transport, and 1,000 other things. This war is being conducted entirely on paper, entirely in this building. The statistics of the disaster are imaginary, but not fanciful. They represent the level of suffering Cornwall could expect. The situation at the moment is this. The county has no telephones, no electricity, no gas, no mains water and no sewerage system. In many areas, the level of radioactivity is still too high for people to go outside. 3,000 are dead, another 5,000 are dying, and another 56,000 are expected to die from radiation sickness in the weeks ahead. The 3-day exercise has brought together council officials, social workers, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Fire Brigade and the police. It's a war game, but it's deadly serious. If the real thing ever happened, these would be the people with thousands of lives in their hands. The responsibility is a heavy one. If the administration here isn't good enough, the only alternative would be the law of the jungle, a state of anarchy with the strong and ruthless surviving at the expense of the weak.
So, preparations of a sort do exist. It's almost a surprise, isn't it? But how much warning would Mr. Dennis and all the other county controllers have before they had to man their underground control rooms in earnest? The government still seems to assume, and it's a big assumption, that there'll be plenty of time. In 1968, when civil defence was disbanded, they said, "It is recognised we should receive timely, possibly prolonged warning of any change making war more likely." Despite the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when nuclear brinkmanship erupted in days, there's no sign of a change in that basic assumption. It still seems to be supposed, for example, that people would have the time to respond to specially prepared films which begin like this.
The government has decided that in the present state of international tension, you should be told how best to protect yourselves from the dangerous effects of nuclear attack. If this tension should lead to war, it is essential that you shall have taken every possible precaution to safeguard your family, yourself, and your home.
And finally, if the unthinkable started happening, some people in Yorkshire would be the first to know.
The ballistic missiles early warning system at Fylingdales. 3 massive radar domes squatting in the bleak moorland, constantly scanning the skies from the North Pole around to the eastern Mediterranean. This is the home of the famous 4-minute warning, designed to trigger instant retaliation against NATO's attackers. The radars are linked to computers which should identify satellites, debris in orbit, meteorites, all the things which could lead to a false alarm. If the worst happened, the digits on this threat report board would flicker silently to 0 and the men in this room would become the first to witness the onrush of international insanity. It would happen like this.
Uncorrelated event, sir. Go ahead. Okay, right confirmed.
A countdown now absurdly academic. The missiles are halfway here already.
This is the senior duty officer. Confidence report now. Confidence report now. Sorry.
UK alarm level 1, missile attack. Threat to US imminent.
And that's the moment when, in underground control rooms all over the country, county council chief executives become controllers with the powers of a warlord in their own domain. At that moment, too, several hundred other people will be getting their heads down. Men and women of the Royal Observer Corps, the only surviving large body of volunteers in home defence.
Nuclear burst 40.
Their job, after passing on the 4-minute warning, is to track radioactivity. They're part of the warning and monitoring organisation deployed in 800 protective bunkers throughout the country, the only part-timers still trusted with a role in national defence. So the machinery for warning us of nuclear attack and monitoring radioactivity in the weeks that follow is, surprisingly perhaps, both sophisticated and well protected. But what's it all for? Where does all this data end up? And what's the government doing about it? In fact, the government has disappeared by now, dispersed and hiding in secret underground bunkers all over the country. In each one there's a government minister, now known as a commissioner, surrounded by his personal staff, experts, advisors, police and military leaders. One such sub-regional control, as they're known, is in the southwest to administer Devon and Cornwall, or what's left of it. On rare occasions a journalist is allowed in, a film crew rarer still. The visit of a Newswatch crew was only the second in 20 years.
The seat of government for World War III is a former radar station, a leftover from World War II. It's remote, seemingly run down and deserted, totally anonymous. But these drab, rather shabby buildings conceal a secret world. Inside, everything has been prepared for the next Battle of Britain. Beyond the perimeter fence, behind heavy steel doors, there's a warren of corridors, offices and dormitories where 300 people could live for 30 days without needing to set foot outside. The buildings are cocooned in 3.5 feet of reinforced concrete, and half of the complex is underground. It's maintained by a handful of permanent staff. The floors are shiny with polish, the central heating is set at a comfortable 64 degrees, the whole place is ready to be used at a moment's notice. By the time the first bombs were falling, the hatches here would already be firmly battened down, this operations room in full swing. The plan is to move people in during the period of tension expected to precede war. Those people have already been selected and trained. Exercises are held here every few weeks. The government minister who would be in charge has also been appointed, although his name is kept secret. Nobody else but the chosen few would be able to get in. The beds, the blankets, the pillows, pots and pans, knives and forks, all are in place, all have been reserved. There's no room down here for civilian refugees. The preparations even extend to a generous supply of candles, although there's little likelihood of their being needed. If the power supply is cut, the subterranean sanctuary can switch to 2 emergency generators. To drive them, there are nearly 17,000 gallons of oil in storage. Another vital part of the life support system, air conditioning plant with a complex arrangement of filters to stop nuclear fallout getting through. The people living here would also have their own supply of fresh water from a special deep borehole. In short, this is a place where survival is almost guaranteed. The job of the sub-regional control is not to deal with the day-to-day problems of war. Those would be left to local authority district and county controllers. In here, they'd be taking a wider view, assembling a detailed picture of the damage and disaster and making plans for recovery. They're linked to the outside world by special telex and telephone cables and by microwave radio. The communications equipment is not only superb, it's ready to be used today.
The Home Office say that this is the most important part of the headquarters. It's a BBC radio studio, and it's important because it's no good trying to govern people unless they know they're being governed. So this is where the Minister would sit and talk to the West Country after a nuclear attack. He'd try to calm us, give us some hope for the future, and tell us what was being done to help us. Everybody hopes that this is one studio which will never be used.
The secret sub-regional control for Devon and Cornwall in one of those counties. From there, the machinery of government extends to the county controllers in their shelters, to the district council controllers in theirs, and sometimes, though rarely, even down to parish level with whatever they can improvise there. An intricate web of control aimed at the survival of what? Where do people, you and I, figure in all this? Remember, Britain has no evacuation policy and no shelter policy for nuclear attack. For us, there's advice, those special films, for example. Advice which is often out of date, untried, or impossible.
Wherever you live, when you have chosen your fallout room, it should then be modified to improve the protection it can give you. The windows will be the weak point and will have to be blocked in with some heavy material. Using sacks or sandbags, which should be about 2/3 filled, you can block the windows from the outside.
It was calculated last year that a city the size of Hull would need every sandbag in Britain.
You will need to have by you a reserve of tinned and other non-perishable food. This should be enough to feed the whole household and possibly some extra mouths for at least a fortnight.
Could you carry 14 days' supply of food for a family of 4? Could you even buy it when everyone else is following the same advice?
After an attack, it may be necessary to move you and your family to a safer area. To provide for this emergency, you should have a suitcase ready packed. You should include a change of clothes, personal valuables, eating and drinking utensils, and a blanket. Take an overcoat or mackintosh in case of rain.
A thoughtful, practical touch, that. Don't forget your raincoat. The people of Cornwall would certainly have seen that advice no more than 72 hours before they were hit by 4 nuclear missiles. Remember, that's the scenario set for the county's home defence team in that very realistic war games exercise at Truro this week. So, without any public or private shelters, without any pre-planned evacuation scheme for the people of Britain, how would they cope, on paper, with thousands of dead, injured and dying, thousands of aimless refugees in a county still radioactive?
For the moment, the dead remain unburied. There's too much to do simply to keep alive those who survived. In the operations room and the basement offices, the emergency staff weave their way through the administrative nightmare. All their actions, their decisions, must be based on the real world, on the real figures for manpower, equipment and premises.
Transport availability in the post-preparation period.
But you could do the 1,200 at Penzance more easily.
Hospitals are now reckoned to be working in all areas where radiation has fallen to a safe level. Casualty collecting centres are opening up, food supplies are being organised, evacuees are moving into schools and church halls. The controller has handed over to his deputy, Geoffrey Burgess, another senior council official. Straight away, he runs into a problem. There's some trouble in North Cornwall.
There's some widespread unrest in the temporary accommodation centres over the lack of food. And if they're to avoid conflict between the evacuees and the locals, it's essential that we...
Meanwhile, there are other parts of the county where the situation is still too dangerous for any sort of rescue work. On the maps, the shading denotes places where radiation is still high. In those worst affected, it could be weeks before it's safe to move around.
The situation is changing all the time. New problems are being put through for the staff to deal with. Just to see what happens, we decided to put one in ourselves. 30 people have been found in Newquay looting a food store, and they've been arrested. So, what happens to them now?
I would think in a normal circumstance we would release them. Yes, I agree with that. Under the normal bail. I don't think by candidate summary jurisdiction it would be justified for what we assume would be basic shoplifting.
So, for the moment, the looters go free, their crime blurred by the need for survival.
But of course, if the matter gets out of hand, I think we will have to confer again. And if stronger methods are needed, we will have to decide.
Meanwhile, down the corridor in the teleprinter room, a message clatters in from the Minister at the West Country Sub-Regional Control. Attacks on London and the Midlands have left millions homeless. Another 30,000 refugees are on their way to Cornwall.
The first thing, I think, is to get this message to Caradon North Cornwall controllers, because they're the ones who are going to be most affected.
It's one more problem to add to the growing list. This is how it would all happen, a handful of people chipping away at a massive crisis. Recovery would take months, a return to normality many years, if indeed that could ever be achieved within the lifetime of the survivors.
So that was the scene on day one of Cornwall's paper Holocaust. With us in the studio now, Bill Vickers, the Emergency Planning Officer for Cornwall, and John Basson, his opposite number in Devon. Colonel Vickers, how do you feel about the exercise now it's completed?
Well, I'm delighted that we've been able to have this, because we've been able to present to those taking part the sort of problems that they may have to face in a nuclear situation.
Do you feel you learnt any lessons at all from it?
Well, I think that it's pointed out the importance of control room procedures, the importance of knowing the plans thoroughly, and the vital importance of very close liaison with all the organisations involved.
Mr. Basson, these paper exercises are all very well, but they do tend to presuppose, don't they, a fairly long run-in to nuclear attack, a build-up of tension. What happens if we get another Cuba and the tensions mount in 1 week, say?
Well, then we have to telescope parts of the plans to fit in with, in fact, the warning time that we get. And this is part of our job, to see that our plans are built so that we can take that into account.
Can you cope with that short period? Can you move the stores, the stretchers, the people?
Well, obviously, the shorter the period, the less you can do of the things you want to do. But there are certain essentials which, if you get a very short warning period, if you can put those in, then at least you can begin to do something about the situation.
Now, you've said, Colonel Vickers, that this was a very salutary effort for your staff, but what about the man and woman walking in the street above your bunker? Do you think they know anything more at all about how they would cope in a nuclear attack now?
Well, I think there is a scarcity of information to the public, and I would like to see the public more informed as to what is being done on their behalf.
How would you conduct this information campaign?
Well, I think this will have to be done on a national basis.
Other countries, though, do keep the public informed, don't they? Why doesn't Britain?
It is part of government policy, and whichever government happens to be in office decides on its policy on home defence.
You're saying it's part of government policy to keep us in the dark?
No. They decide on the level that they want the defence measures to take.
How far did you feel, Colonel Vickers, that an effective volunteer force would have been a very useful tool for you in this kind of crisis?
Well, the more people that can be trained and have knowledge before the event, the more likely are your plans to succeed.
We've already heard in the programme that we've lost most of the volunteers we used to have. Do you regret that?
Personally, yes.
We already have, though, some volunteer force in Devon, I believe, Mr. Besson.
Yes, we're very lucky here. We have a thing called the Devon Emergency Volunteers, which is a growing force, I'm glad to say now. Its main involvement is going to be at the parish and community level, where it's got already a very important role, and we're hoping shortly to expand the roles of the volunteers at the parish and community level.
And do you think you might take the example from Devon, Colonel Vickers, and set up the similar organisation in Cornwall?
Well, I would like to see this done on a national basis, possibly a modified civil defence corps.
You don't think the governments have said, you know, civil defence is a useless thing as far as...
Well, I think that it was for economic reasons, was it not, that the Civil Defence Corps was disbanded in 1968.
But you think perhaps now the time is right to bring it back?
I think it would be a very useful addition to our home defence preparations.
Now, there are some differences of approach, I believe, between the two of you. For example, in Cornwall, the staff can't take their families down to the bunkers with them, can they? In Devon, they can. Why do you let the families go with you?
Well, we may have different problems of travelling and distance between where people live and the control centre, and it just happens that we feel that this is a way of manning the control.
But do you feel that your staff would willingly abandon their loved ones to their fate above ground and come and join you below?
Well, there may be problems in some quarters, and if the whole staff doesn't turn up, then we manage with the staff that does. But don't forget that the bulk of the effort is going to be required in the post-attack phase.
So here we have discrepancies between two counties. Do you think this is a classic case for some sort of unified national strategy, Mr. Besson?
Yes, I think that we do need a definite national strategy on home defence.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. There is, in fact, a great deal of secrecy surrounding home defence. Many experts can't think why. A booklet telling us what to do for our own protection, for example, is unobtainable, a classified document. These are instructions for chief constables in the event of a nuclear war. They're so secret that even the county controllers aren't allowed to know what's in them, and they're supposed to be the ones who are running the show. Quite a few people who've studied this subject think our Home Office planning is absurdly out of date, and for that reason it's given as little publicity as possible as a matter of policy. Could that be the reason, for example, why Lord Belstead, the government minister in charge of home defence, wouldn't be interviewed for Newswatch this month? Home defence, according to one MP, is an ill-coordinated shambles, lacking finance, resources and manpower. That MP, Mr. Robert Banks, wrote a booklet exposing Britain's lack of preparation and campaigning for changes. And last night, in response to a question from him, the government said it's looking into ways of making improvements. He's in our London studio now. Mr. Banks, what were you hoping to achieve with your question in the House yesterday?
Well, I really wanted to find out from the Home Secretary what progress was being made in reviewing the home defence of this country. And I received the reply, which is that the Home Secretary is considering what improvements he can make, which I must admit is very disappointing, because we want to see a full review of home defence and the implementation of what I think are very necessary improvements.
It seems from your book that the state of Britain's home defences leave you something close to despair.
Well, I'm afraid that is the case, yes. I think there are certain parts of our home defence organisation which is good. For instance, United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation, which is a very, very well organised function of the Royal Observer Corps. That is good. It needs improvements. But on the question of information for the public, then I think we have a most appalling situation on our hands.
How much difference do you think an effective home defence policy would make in terms of lives, perhaps?
Well, I think an enormous number of lives would be saved, given a situation where we found ourselves suffering from nuclear radiation, either as a result of war or as a result of explosions which could take place in Europe, and the radiation would in fact drift over to our country. But as things stand at the moment, there is no policy at all to shelter the civilian population, And quite clearly, if a high proportion of the population were sheltered, they would be saved from disaster.
Now, how does Britain compare then with other European countries in the state of its home defence?
Well, with some, extraordinarily badly. For instance, Sweden and Switzerland are very good examples of really a total shelter policy, where in Switzerland, for instance, by the end of the 1980s, I believe the entire population will be housed in shelters. In France, for instance, they've just issued a booklet which is available to the public to describe how houses can be adapted to provide shelter accommodation, that is in the core of the house or in the basement. They are now working through the country, taking certain areas and then doing a full survey to find out what existing structures could be adapted for shelter accommodation.
And these are the kind of measures you want to see in this country?
Exactly. Absolutely exactly what we should be doing.
Well, now, you wrote your booklet when the Labour government was in power. Your own party now occupies the government benches, so are you hoping for an immediate change?
Well, I want to see a change very badly. I think that the problem at the moment is, of course, government expenditure. The policy is to cut down expenditure. I happen to think that home defence is an area which comes under the total defence of our people, of our country, and so therefore should be given the emphasis which I think it really must deserve.
But isn't it true that after a major nuclear attack, the devastation would be so complete that any attempt at home defence would be really useless?
That's not true. I don't think you would imagine that a potential aggressor would drop so many nuclear bombs over this country that it would devastate the whole of the country. Military strategists, for instance, reckon that perhaps 200 megatons of nuclear devices would be dropped on the country. Now, if there was a shelter policy, some 15 million lives could be saved. 40% of the population would be in what would be termed fringe areas, where they would be only marginally affected by the radiation. Of course, those who are directly under the bomb would be affected. But there is a myth here that has grown up that if we go into a nuclear war situation, then the whole of the country has had it. Now, that is entirely wrong. It's quite untrue.
Can I ask you finally whether you think that some kind of nuclear war is inevitable?
I think that when you look at the situation today with the build-up of armed forces all over the world, in particular over the Soviet Union, this terrific war machine which has been built up dramatically in the last 10 years, then I think you would be very, very wise to unwise to bury your head in the sand and try and pretend that war is not a possibility.
Mr. Banks, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Strong arguments then for a rethink in Britain's home defence planning. Many experts feel it's long overdue. There is, they believe, too much of a gap between paper exercises, however thorough, and the sort of chaos to be found above ground after a nuclear attack. From Newswatch till our next programme in 1980, a happy new year and a peaceful new decade.
Wherever you live, when you have chosen your fallout room, it should then be modified to improve the protection it can give you.
Take her away. Oh, please. Oh, no, I don't want to. Take her away. We're going to help her. Oh, please.
To provide for this emergency, you should have a suitcase ready packed. Take an overcoat or mackintosh in case of rain.